we will continue to explore the reason the first two political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalist, form, and review some of the things we learned about already. So, in the previous lesson, we learned about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. There being various issues between the two. The Federalists, of course, were led by Alexander Hamilton. Charles Pinckney was a Federalist as well. The Federalists appealed more to the wealthy in the country. They wanted to pay the debt and assume the state debts from the Revolutionary War, create a national bank, pass a protective tariff, and they were mainly from low country South Carolina, New England, and other areas of wealth in the United States. The Democratic Republicans were more the poor farmers and working class. They were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were mainly from the poorer areas, such as the upcountry in South Carolina. In general, the Federalists, they called for an economic policy that would strengthen the national government. They proposed the federal government pay the debt that was incurred from the Revolution and assume the state debts. They also proposed a national bank and asked Congress to pass a high protective tariff on imported goods to encourage Americans to make goods at home and also buy American-made goods rather than purchase foreign ones. Two political parties would develop over these disagreements. They are the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The biggest issue of division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans was the creation of a national bank to issue banknotes and collect taxes. The Federalists' desire to create a national bank would lead to two theories of interpretation of the Constitution: loose versus strict. In a loose interpretation, the government would have more power because it would not be limited by the explicit statements of the Constitution. The Federalists cited the necessary and proper clause as justification to create a national bank. The Democratic Republicans disagreed with the Federalists and thought that the Constitution should be interpreted strictly. And they felt that the government could only do exactly what the Constitution says. In the end, however, George Washington sided with the Federalists. A loose interpretation is the interpretation of the Constitution that is used, and the national bank was created. The final issue that the Federalists and Democratic Republicans would come to terms with was the assumption of state debt. Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of Treasury, wanted to assume the state debts, pay off all of the money the states owed. Most Democratic Republicans opposed the assumption of state debts. However, South Carolinians were in support of this on both sides, and that is because much of the war had been fought in South Carolina, and therefore the state had more debt. In the end, the Democratic Republicans agreed to support the assumption of state debts because the Federalists agreed to move the capital of the nation to the banks of the Potomac River and create what's known as the federal city of Washington, D.C. Does anyone know what this is? It's from last year, some of your favorite lessons, I'm sure. Yes, it's the Bastille, and it is the next subject of disagreement between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Bastille, of course, was the beginning of the French Revolution, which began in 1789. There would be differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans actually supported the French in the overthrow of their king, while the Federalists were appalled by the bloodshed. And when France declared war on Britain, the Federalists sided with their ex-mother country, hoping for more trade. George Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, and in the Napoleonic Wars that would follow the French Revolution, the U.S. attempted to remain neutral. So the French Revolution would cause further division between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And we've learned the French Revolution was from 1789 to 1799. The Federalists, led, of course, by Alexander Hamilton, were appalled at the bloodshed. They said, "Oh my, the bloodshed is appalling. Killing the rich and elite." Now, if you keep in mind, the rich and elite were who the Federalists were. So, naturally, they didn't want a similar thing to happen in our country. The Democratic Republicans, though, who were mainly the poor, even though Thomas Jefferson was a wealthy plantation owner, he represented the Democratic Republicans. They said, "Go, French poor. Overthrow your king and those rich elite that are taking your money unjustly." Alexander Hamilton, of course, or not Alexander Hamilton being the Federalist, James Madison, I'm trying to quickly draw here. Overthrow your king, and of course the farmers, and those rich city folk, or the nobility in France. So the poor being more like the third estate. Well, during the French Revolution, the Federalists, as was said previously, France then declares war on Britain because things became quite complicated then, and the Federalists sided with their ex-mother country, Britain, so they can secure more trade. And the Democratic Republicans, being that we just fought against Britain roughly less than 20 years, not even 20, barely over 10, wonder how can anyone want to side with Britain after we just fought a very bloody war with them for independence. Now, the Napoleonic Wars would begin during the French Revolution. And of course, Napoleon would eventually come to power in France as their emperor. shortly after the revolution ended. And in 1799, Napoleon, let's draw his big hat, and let's draw a person, stick figure, that will represent Napoleon, was in power in France. Not my best work, but it'll do. Well, and Napoleon is at war with most of Europe. Now, the United States desires to stay out of these wars, and our first president wisely says America will stay neutral in the Napoleonic Wars. Well, George Washington proclaimed neutrality, but there would be challenges to American neutrality, and one of these challenges would become an issue between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Before we get into that, we are going to look at how most of France was under attack by other monarchs in Europe who did not want to see a situation similar to the French Revolution take place in their country. So the rise of Napoleon happened because the French Revolution made all the neighboring monarchies nervous, because they did not want their people to rebel against them. Then they would find their head in a guillotine. So when Louis XVI was executed during the French Revolution, many European nations attacked France to keep these revolutionary ideas from spreading. Revolutionary France was a battlefield within and from attacks within and from foreign powers. And it was this fighting that would lead to the rise of Napoleon, who was actually off fighting outside of France before his ascension to power. The next episode actually occurs before Napoleon is in power in France. George Washington proclaimed in 1795 that America would remain neutral. And shortly after, there would be a challenge to American neutrality, which would lead to further division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. This episode involves our second president, which some of you may know is John Adams. John Adams, wanting to keep American neutrality, had to send a delegation of diplomats to France to negotiate peace and keep us neutral. John Adams was a Federalist, and he sent his Secretary of State, I believe, who was our own Charles Pinckney. He also sent other Federalist cabinet members, Eldridge Gerry, and someone else, I forget, to France to negotiate peace and keep America neutral. So President John Adams tells Charles Pinckney to go to France to negotiate peace and keep us, America, neutral. Wise decision, because America could really not afford to get into a war since we had our own problems. Charles Pinckney says, okay, and he goes to France. And he says, hey, French, Charlie has arrived. in 1798. Charles Pinckney says, "Now, let me talk to your leader." This was in 1798. Napoleon's fighting, but he would shortly take over power. But France was in a state of chaos, and the leader was not yet Napoleon. The leader was some guy named the Marquis de Talleyrand. Well, Charles Pinckney's sitting there waiting for the Marquis de Talleyrand to show up, which would be like the president of France at the time. Instead, who shows up to talk to Charles Pinckney were 3 French officials. Their names were Jean H., Pierre B., and Nicholas H. And they greeted Charles Pinckney, and I'm going to put on my French accent to read this part to you. And they said, "Oh, ce sorry, Charlie, the Marquis is busy. If the U.S. gives he and France a bribe, he'll free up." Well, Charles Pinckney said, "What'd they say?" to his fellow things, and he says, "A bribe? You want a bribe from America? You want just for us to talk to them?" He says, "Oh, we won't give you a bribe." He gets mad again, just like he did over the Three-Fifths Compromise. And he says, "This is outrageous. America will spend millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. We won't give you a 6 pence, which I believe was a penny cut into 6 pieces. Now, this leads to a quasi-war between France and the new United States. It wasn't an open war, but if American ships ran into each other, and American and French ships, they may fire on each other. It was a very tense situation. Now, this episode of Charles Pinckney going to France as an American diplomat, being asked for a bribe from the French, which was an enormous amount of money. I think they wanted like $10 million today. This has been known as the XYZ affair. Now, why it's known as the XYZ affair is the following. When Charles Pinckney returned home, fuming over the French asking him for a bribe, and John Adams said, "Hey, Charlie, what happened over there?" Said, "Well, they asked me for a bribe." "Oh, man, the nerve," John Adams said. "The French think they can bully us around because we're a new country." Well, when they wrote up the report of what happened, they left out the names Jean H., Pierre B., and Nicholas H., and they wrote in the letters XYZ as the officials that asked for the bribe. So, the official record says that when Charles Pinckney and Eldridge Gerry and another American diplomat were met by the French, 3 French officials, XYZ, asked the American diplomats for a bribe. Of course, the Americans were upset and stormed out the room and told the French that they would rather go to war than pay a bribe. To look at the PowerPoint about this part, foreign policy would become a point of division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Just a recap, President John Adams sent Charles Pinckney to negotiate peace with France. Pinckney and two other Americans met with 3 representatives, XYZ, from the French government who asked for a bribe. Pinckney says, no, 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 not a 6-pence. I believe it's a penny cut into 6 pieces. And said that America will spend millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. The incident became known as the XYZ affair and brought the emerging political parties into conflict because the Federalists, who in their mind were shamed by the French, wanted war. However, the Democratic Republicans realized that war would not be an intelligent decision. This also led to a quasi-war between America and France. That's all for this lesson. Thank you for listening. I hope you did well.